And some of you are going to remember that song from the 90s. It was by Alanis Morissette, a Canadian singer, so I got to give credit to a Canadian here when I can. The song was called Ironic. And the song is pretty simple. She's just singing about all these different things that she finds to be ironic. And so I won't sing it for you, but some of the lines like, it's like rain on your wedding day, or it's like good advice that you didn't take, or it's like 10,000 forks when all you need is a spoon, or something like that. Do you remember that song? Now, my kids will tell you that I hate that song. I have nothing against a Canadian musician, believe me. I don't like that song, though, because none of the things in the song are ironic. Right? Ironic, by definition, irony, and you remember, for those of you in high school, you're learning this, and hopefully you remember it. Irony, by definition, is the opposite of what you should expect. Right? So, like, if you plan a wedding and it rains on your wedding day, that's too bad, but it's not really ironic. It's just inconvenient. If you need a fork and you open the silverware door and there's just a bunch of spoons in there, that's annoying, but it's not really ironic by definition. Have I made my case enough here yet? The reason I tell you that is because as you think about what irony is, right? Irony is the exact opposite of what you'd expect. When you read through John's gospel narrative, when you read through the story of Christ's suffering and death, one writer says, and he says it well, I think, one writer says that this story is filled with glorious gospel irony. Glorious gospel irony. That is to say that when you approach this story, there's so much here that we shouldn't expect, and yet there it is. It's the opposite. The story in so many ways goes against the grain of what we should expect to find. Let me see if I can show you what I mean by that. Take a look, and we're picking up the story kind of where we left it off last week. Jesus is on trial in front of Pilate, and one of the things, if you pay attention to the dialogue, you pay attention to what Jesus and Pilate are saying to one another, you begin to ask yourself the question, who's really in charge here? Who really has the authority? Think about that with me for a moment. Pilate is one of the most powerful people around. He's in a position of authority put there by Caesar himself, a position with great influence, great power, and he has, by his own statement, we'll see in a minute, he claims, I've got power. And then you look at Jesus, a man on trial for his life, a man with a death sentence hanging over him. And then you ask yourself the question, who really has the power? Pilate says, if you look with me, and you have your Bibles open, look with me please at verse 10. Pilate says to Jesus, don't you realize that I have the power to either release you or to either free you or to crucify you? Pilate's saying, I have the power here. I have the authority. That's a bold statement to make. Pilate's saying, your life is in my hands, and I can do with you what I wish. Now that's a strong statement, but look at what Jesus says. And maybe actually look at what Jesus doesn't say. Jesus doesn't argue with Pilate. He doesn't say, no, you don't. He actually affirms what Pilate says. Verse 11, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. In other words, Jesus says to Pilate, you do have power. You are in a position of authority. But notice what Jesus does. Jesus relocates the source of power. In those days, really much like today, power was something that you earned, something that you worked for, it was something that you achieved, or it was something that you got because you had the right connections. You were well placed, you knew people in high places, and so power was something then that you could attain that way. But either way, power was something, you might say power was something that came from within. It came from who you were. You worked for it, earned it, deserved it, worked your way up the chain, and put yourself in a position of power, or you had the right connections who then put you in a position of power. What Jesus says is, you've misunderstood what power is all about. You don't see where power really comes from. Jesus says the source of power is from above. God is the one who gives power. We are simply stewards of that power. We are simply people who manage that power. Now, the reason I draw your attention to that is because I think back. We read earlier this morning, we read from Psalm 8, where actually Psalm 8 is a psalm about power. It's about the God who creates the universe. It's about a God who is sovereign over all things. And yet it's about a God who puts you and I in positions of power and of authority in this world. He gives us positions of influence in the world around us. All of you have power in some way. All of you have some measure of influence. If you're at school, maybe you're the one kid that the other kids kind of listen to. When you speak up, everyone pays attention to what you're saying. And so you have the ability to influence other students. If other kids are picking on someone and you join in, everyone else is going to think it's okay. But if you speak up and say, hey, we shouldn't do that, everyone else will listen to you, right? That's power. Some of you are in positions at work. You're a supervisor or you're a manager. You've got people under you. Right? That's power in the world. Sometimes it's just less formal. Sometimes it's just your influence in the community. It's your service at church. Right? Those are places where you carry influence, where you carry a measure of power. And the question is, how do we handle that power? How does God call us to use that power and that influence? And what Pilate is showing us here, or I should say what Jesus is showing us by talking to Pilate, is that the power that we have is stewarded to us by God. God is the source of power. Right? God is the one who calls us to manage and use our influence in this world in ways that reflect that the power is not ours, but it's given to us on loan from God. Now here's another question that begins to come up. Who's really in charge of this whole story? Who's really writing this whole narrative? Think about it with me in this way. God had ordained this work of Jesus Christ from before time. God had this plan. He had this purpose for Jesus to come and lay down his life and to suffer and die for the salvation of his people. And God uses a lot of people like Judas. He uses soldiers who arrest Jesus. He uses Pilate, who's in this position. And the question is, are these individuals, are they acting of their own free will, or are they just simply doing what God is sort of making them do? Right? Who's really writing the story here? Is Pilate really in control? Is Pilate accountable? Is he responsible for his actions? Is Judas responsible for his actions, or can we just say that Judas was, God needed to have someone to betray Jesus, and so Judas was the one that happened to be chosen by God to do that? He was just sort of acting as a puppet. Right? Who's really in power here? Who's really writing the story? I want you to look with me at verse 11, because Jesus says something that sheds a little bit of light on that. Jesus actually says, "Therefore the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Getting back to that whole question of power, who's really in control, who's really responsible, Jesus talks about someone. We don't know if he's talking about Judas or if he's talking about the soldiers or who, but Jesus says, whoever he's talking about, says, that person who handed me over is guilty of a greater sin. In other words, they are responsible for their actions. They will be held accountable for their place in the story, but God is still sovereign over the whole story. In other words, God is using individuals who are acting in sinful ways, and he's using them still to accomplish his plan and his purpose. Now, we have a word for that theologically. The word is concurrence. It means that human individuals are responsible for their own actions. God permits them to do things of their own free will, and he holds them responsible, but he still uses their actions to accomplish his greater purpose. He is still sovereign over the whole story. He's still the author of the whole story. Now, let's look at another one of these ironies in this whole story. Right? Pilate claims to have this power. He claims, your life, Jesus, is in my hands. I can hand you over to death or I can set you free. He's claiming to be in control. But have you ever seen someone more fearful than Pilate? Do you realize how much Pilate is swayed by the crowds around him? I mean, just look with me for a moment. Go back to verse 7 and 8. Chief priests and their officials see Jesus. They cry out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate says, "You crucify him. I can't find anything wrong with him." Right? There you hear Pilate's conviction. Pilate is convinced in his mind that Jesus is innocent, but does he stand by his conviction? Does he hold fast to what he believes? No. The Jews push back and they say, "No, this man has to die because he claimed to be the Son of God." Now listen, Pilate was a Roman. He was shaped by Roman culture. Roman culture believed that the gods up in the heavens could come down and kind of walk around and mingle around among ordinary average people. And so when Pilate hears that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, immediately Pilate begins to wonder, have one of the gods come down? Am I looking at one of the gods? Now, in a strange sort of way, Pilate is actually pretty close to the truth, isn't he? Right? Pilate is afraid that one of the gods is standing in front of him, and he doesn't want to be responsible for handing this god over to death. And yet Pilate still doesn't act according to his conviction. He still lets his fear govern him. Verse 12, we go a little bit further. Pilate again tries to set Jesus free, but the Jews keep shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." And they go on and they say, if you claim to be a king, anyone who claims to be a king is opposing Caesar. The Jews are simply saying, this man, Jesus, claims authority that would rival Caesar's. So Pilate, you better do something or we're going to go and tell Caesar that someone in the kingdom is setting up a rebellion, is starting a rebellion in the kingdom. Right? The Jews are threatening Pilate. You better do what we say, or we're going to get you in a lot of trouble. And Pilate understands that one of two things will happen. Best case scenario, Caesar finds out that Pilate didn't put Jesus to death, throws him out of office, strips him of his authority, tosses him out on the street, and that's the end of Pilate's career. That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario, Caesar decides that Pilate is a threat to the peace and stability of the Roman Empire because he won't punish wrongdoers, and he puts Pilate to death. So again, Pilate is afraid. For all the authority that Pilate claims to have, for all the influence and the power that he claims to have, Pilate is a fearful man. And he's easily swayed by the opinions and the voice of the crowd. And if you jump down to verse 16, we finally see that Pilate hands Jesus over to be crucified. We'll come back to that more next week into what the implications of that are. But the point for right now is that Pilate is a man ruled by his fears, not his convictions. Now, if you think about it, actually, that actually is a picture, a small microcosm, if you will, of what the nature of sin is all about. Here's what I mean by that. Jesus is the true king standing in front of Pilate. And yet, does Pilate trust Jesus? Does he look to Jesus as the authority? No, he doesn't. He insists on his own authority, and he's ruled by his fear. If you go back to Genesis chapter 3 in the Garden of Eden, the Bible paints a picture of the beginning of creation. God, the sovereign king, the creator, the Lord of everything, puts Adam and Eve in the garden, sets them there to work in a relationship of trust and submission and obedience to God. Right? The king puts his people in the kingdom, if you will, and calls them to service. Adam and Eve rebel against the king. They turn against God, and what they're essentially doing is saying, we're going to be our own sovereign. We're going to claim authority to do what we wish. We're going to be in power. And do you remember the very first thing that crept into creation after Adam and Eve sinned? The moment Adam and Eve claimed that they could be the authority over God, do you remember what emotion crept in? It's more than an emotion, but we'll start with that. It was fear. All of a sudden they were afraid. See, when you reject the authority of the king, you're ruled by fear. I'll give you just a couple of examples of what that actually looks like. If you are someone that worry about what other people think of you, at your very heart, what you've forgotten is you've forgotten what the true king thinks of you. If you forget how God sees you, if you forget how God looks at you, if you forget that you have the love and the acceptance and the eternal security of belonging to Jesus Christ, you start to worry about what everyone else thinks of you. You have a desperate need for approval. And you're driven by that need for approval and that fear of rejection. You'll find it's really hard for you to say no to people. Because somewhere on some level, you're not relying on, you're not resting in what the true king thinks of you. Do you see how that works? Or if you fear the future, some of you fear the future. Some of you look down the line 6 months, a year, couple of years, and you have no idea what the future holds. You're worried for your kids. You're worried about the decisions that they're making. You're worried about the path that they're on. Some of you worry about retirement. It's just a couple of years off, and you're worried, will I have enough to take care of myself? Will we be financially secure? You worry about relationships that you have. One of the things that flows out of is that we're trying to be king ourselves. We're trying to claim that authority over our lives and over our circumstances. We want to run the show. And we're forgetting to trust the one sovereign king. Look at Jesus in this story. If there's one person in this story that would make sense to have fear, wouldn't it be Jesus? He's on trial for his life. He's facing death. He knows it. And yet you won't find a more composed person. He's the only one that appears really calm, cool, and collected. Now, I don't want to overstate that, but if you go back to the previous chapters and if you cross-reference to the other Gospels who also tell us what happened before Jesus faced all this, what was Jesus doing? He was spending time in prayer. And you remember what he was praying about? Really, one of the things he was doing was wrestling with God. He was saying, Lord, if there's any other way to accomplish this work, then let this cup pass from me. But if not, then not my will, but yours. You see what he's doing there? He's surrendering himself into the authority and the sovereign will of God. He's trusting in the King. He's putting himself he's putting his very life in the hands of the Father, and he's trusting the King and his sovereign wisdom, his sovereign purpose, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. Now, do you see what that means very practically for you and for me? When you face fear, when you worry, when you're anxious about the future, when you worry too much about what other people think of you, what's the antidote for that? What's the response? We need to wrestle in prayer with God, and one of the parts of that is, Lord, help me trust your will. Help me trust that you are the sovereign King. That even in the face of unimaginable anguish and agony, Lord, I can trust you. I can put my life in your hands. That's what Jesus is doing. And we need to preach that gospel to ourselves too. Even as we pray, we need to remind ourselves, Lord, when I'm criticized by other people, when I dread saying no to someone, when I feel like I'm being ruled by the crowd around me, Lord, help me remember that I already have your love and acceptance and approval. When we fear the future, what do we say to ourselves? Lord, my life is in your hands. When our circumstances mount up against us and we're in the midst of adversity, we can cry out in anguish and we can say, Lord, your will be done. Help me to trust your sovereign purposes. And that brings out a whole other really glorious gospel irony, and I want to show you what this looks like. Early in our text, early in the chapter, Pilate has Jesus flogged, and he has Jesus, they put the crown of thorns on his head, and they wrap this robe of righteousness, or this robe of rags around him, and they make Jesus look like a parody of a king, to mock him and to humiliate him. Right? They clothe Jesus and spit on him and mistreat him. And then Pilate brings Jesus out and he stands in front of the crowd and he says that's actually a very famous moment in verse 5. Pilate says, "Here is the man, behold the man." Interestingly, if some of you are into art and you follow artwork, we've been displaying some of the pictures of different scenes painted by different artists over the last few weeks. This is a scene that has been painted many, many, many times by a good number of artists where Pilate holds and points to Jesus. Behold the man. Now, I need to show you something to help you understand how dramatic of a moment and how powerful of a moment this is. If you have your Bible still open, turn to the Old Testament, to the book of Zechariah. And this is worth looking at just a paragraph or so here. And I have to tell you, I didn't see this until just a week or two ago, and when I saw it, it jumped off the page at me. Zechariah chapter 6, if you want to follow along, it's page 1477 in your Bible. The prophet Zechariah is given this vision from God. And it's a vision and a mission. Zechariah is told to go to the temple and to address the priest in the temple. He's told to carry this out, and it was sort of like an acted-out sermon for the people. The people would see what Zechariah would do, and it would communicate the message to them. Now follow with me, Zechariah 6, beginning at verse 9. The word of the Lord came to me, that's to Zechariah. Take silver and gold from the exiles, Heldai, Tobijah, and Jedediah, who have arrived from Babylon. Go the same day to the house of Josiah, son of Zephaniah. Take the silver and the gold and make a crown and set it on the head of the high priest, Joshua. That's the Hebrew name, by the way, of Jesus, isn't it? Son of Jehozadak. Tell him this is what the Lord Almighty says. Now listen to this. Here is the man whose name is the branch. And he will branch out from this place and build the temple of the Lord. It is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he will be clothed with majesty and will sit and rule on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne. And there will be harmony between the two. We'll stop there. Real briefly, in those days, you didn't have a priest and a king. That would be like having a president become the chief justice of the Supreme Court. You don't mix your branches of government. You don't have a priest and a king, but Zechariah is coming and saying, there will come a time when the priest becomes a king. And this king will be clothed with royal garments. And this king, this priest king, will rule over the people. He will have authority to extend his kingdom. Right? Zechariah had that vision, and so the people of Israel began to long for and expect and hope for and anticipate the day that this king would come to establish God's kingdom in the world. And no doubt they were expecting a king of great pomp and circumstance and royalty and gold and silver and wealth. That's the kind of king they were expecting. Now, Zechariah didn't live long enough to see how that vision was carried out in its fullness. But I suspect if Zechariah had somehow been allowed to last a few hundred years and to stand in that crowd, his jaw would have hit the ground when he saw how God actually carried out this vision. Because as Pilate brings Jesus out in front of the crowd, it's a frame-by-frame replay of what Zechariah did, with one major difference. Zechariah brings out a priest king who's clothed in gold and silver and royal robes. Zechariah says, here is the man. Here is the king. Here's the one who's going to establish the kingdom and the rule of God in this world. And Pilate brings out the priest king, who's not clothed in gold and silver, and he's not wearing a robe of purple and fine linen. Behold the man, the king, who's wearing a crown of thorns, who's wearing torn and tattered robes meant to make a mockery of the king. And Pilate says, here's the man. Here's the king. Here's the one who's going to establish God's sovereign rule in this world. Do you believe it? Who would believe that a king wearing mocking robes and a crown of thorns mocked in front of the crowds? Who would believe that God could bring about His kingdom in that way. You'd look at that and you'd say, that's impossible. There's no way God is bringing about His reign and His rule in the world through this kind of a king. But you see, John's point and John's glorious gospel irony is that is exactly how God brings about His kingdom. That is exactly how God establishes His power in this world. God's kingdom, His reign, His authority isn't established by brute force or pomp and circumstance or connections in high places. God establishes His royal kingdom in this world through suffering and through sacrifice. God defeats evil not by overpowering it in strength, but by submission, sacrifice, humility, suffering. That's how God establishes His kingdom in this world. That's how God, we might say, stewards His authority in this world. That's how God uses His power. And then you begin to see what He expects of and what He calls for us. When I said earlier that you and I have been given positions of power, we've been given a place of influence, do you begin to see what that means? If this is what our king does, if our king conquers evil by suffering, by laying himself down, by sacrificing himself, then that's exactly how you and I are called to live our lives. You and I, some of us, what this is going to mean is that we find places of brokenness and hurting and pain in this world. And we're not going to run away from it. We don't avoid those places in this world where there's great pain and grief. We don't avoid the places of poverty. We don't avoid the places of addiction. We don't avoid the places where sin has such an iron grip on this world. We enter into it. We go to become a part of it. We walk right into it. And we use the authority that God gives us to serve, to love those who are hurting, to sacrifice of ourselves for the benefit of others, to show Christ's love. That means that everywhere, from your marriage, what does your marriage look like? It begins to look like the shape of the cross, where you are actually serving your spouse. In parenting, you see your role not just as an iron-fisted ruler over your home, but one who uses your position to serve in ways that are godly, to use your authority in godly ways. You sacrifice for your kids. You go to school and you see the kid that everyone has picked on and they're eating lunch by themselves. And if you have that position of authority, what you're going to do is you're actually going to include that person in. Even if it means that you get made fun of a little bit. Even if it costs you something. Now the question is, how can we do this? Because you know what? There's a couple of things that can happen. The first is that we can take the power that we've been given and we can use it for our own gain. We can abuse our positions of power. And that happens far too often. Far too often. Or we can avoid sacrifice. We can say that's too costly. To love the poor, to care for the brokenhearted, to enter into the places of pain and brokenness in this world is too costly. How can we do that? And that is what brings us, I think, to the greatest gospel irony. The only thing that's going to motivate you to serve, to use your authority in this world in a way that's patterned after the king, is when you see how the king uses his authority for you. See, it was the king who was crowned with thorns so that you might wear a crown of righteousness. It was the king who lost his royal robes and wore the mocking robe of parody so that you might be clothed in the perfection of Jesus. It was Jesus who was put out of his kingdom, rejected, kicked out of his own city, rejected by his own people, and on the cross finally ignored even by his own Father. Why? So that you might be brought in, so that you might be made part of the royal family. That's how God loves you. That's how God uses His authority. That's how God uses His position. You know, the story is told of William Wilberforce, the